Hi, everyone. Welcome to the last Distinguished Foreign Seminar for this semester. We'll be starting back up again in January. I am Rachel Tenney. I'm a PhD student in environmental engineering. I'm advised by Paige Novak and Tim LaPera. Before I introduce Professor Armstrong, I just want to let everyone know that there will be a Q&A at the end. You can ask questions kind of aloud the traditional way. You can put questions in the Zoom chat, and then there is also a completely anonymous Google form where you can submit questions that you may not want to ask aloud or explicitly in the chat. So I will be mediating the chat in that Google form and kind of facilitate that discussion. Okay, so with that said, it's my pleasure to introduce Mary A. Armstrong. She is a Charles A. Dana Professor of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies and English at Lafayette College, where she also chairs the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program. She earned her PhD in English and graduate certification in Women's Studies from Duke University. Her research interests include equity and inclusivity in STEM fields, strategies for institutional transformation in higher education, and inclusive pedagogies. She has been the PI on 2 National Science Foundation advance grants focused on strategies for institutional change to support underrepresented women in STEM, and she's the director of the Lafayette College Queer Archives Project. Professor Armstrong is also the first openly LGBTQ professor I ever met, and somebody I very much admire. If you know me, you may not be surprised that having never met Professor Armstrong, never taken one of her classes, I went and knocked on her door to introduce myself. And together we developed and launched Lafayette's first ever LGBTQ mentoring program for students, faculty, and staff. So I'm happy to see you again, Professor Armstrong. Thank you so much for being here, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Rachel, for that really nice introduction. And thanks to everybody for joining me today. We all know what time of year it is. And so showing up at a lecture is doubly appreciated within our busy lives. It's always appreciated, but I know you folks are in finals and we are here too at Lafayette. I'm really honored to be part of the Distinguished Warren Lecture Series. My thanks to the Department of Civil, Environmental, and Geoengineering, and to the Lecture Series Committee Chair, Judy Yang, for inviting me, and of course, enormous thanks to Rachel Tenney, my host, who has introduced me so generously and is also willing to field and sort of manage the questions afterwards. You can well imagine that Rachel is still missed here at Lafayette, where she wasn't just an outstanding student, she was really an outstanding campus citizen. So we remember her well, and I'm very happy to reconnect with her through this lecture. And I'm very excited to do this lecture, very excited to give it. I've actually went and done my homework and reviewed some of the recent talks for the Warren Lecture Series. I think it would not be wrong to claim that I am not your average Warren lecturer because I'm not an engineer. And all my predecessors' talks seems to be very STEM content oriented and exploratory and solutions oriented and enviously fascinating. But my hope in sort of placing myself within the larger schema of this lecture series is that at the end of the talk, you might be willing to also consider my talk as something that is STEM content oriented and exploratory and solutions oriented. And if I'm really lucky, fascinating, but I won't push it. So I will point out again that at every single slide, there is a QR code. It is anonymous and it's a place to ask questions about the content of my talk, which is called Beyond Diversity, Reimagining the Work of Inclusive STEM. I will get started with that right now and move along, but you will see that same QR code over and over again as I go forward. So let's see if I can. Interesting. My slides are not advancing. There we go. Okay, so when Judy invited me, she'd asked me if she asked me to spend a few minutes at the very beginning of the seminar sharing some information about career paths. So I'm going to do this very quickly, but I wanted to say that for any of the graduate students who are present, I have noticed in putting together this fun and very quick slide that one's career path is so powerfully molded by both choice and circumstance, which I would imagine my fellow faculty would agree with very much. I started out at Duke with a PhD in English, and I was really interested in interdisciplinary work, and also in issues of social justice. So I started working at the interdisciplinary graduate level in women's studies. And I know, just talking very briefly to Bill Arnold ahead of the lecture, that you folks are doing some really cool interdisciplinary stuff. So I started with an interest in interdisciplinarity as a PhD student. I got my first job at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, and you can see that the interdisciplinary part really started to echo there. I was director of Women's and Gender Studies. That is a very large engineering school, as you're likely to know. And so WGSS worked very closely with the College of Engineering there, and we worked on getting an NSF Advanced grant to assess the idea of how the college could better support diversity in STEM, particularly the advanced grants, if you're familiar with them, are focused on the faculty. I started to think about STEM fields as a particularly interesting way to think about interdisciplinarity and social justice. And so the content of my work started to turn very hard towards STEM content and STEM fields as a way to think about combining ways of thinking in the academy. 10 years later, I ended up at Lafayette College, so I went from a large public to a small private, where I was still chair of WGSS, teaching courses in gender, race, and environmental studies, as well as other things, really focusing here on fostering STEM inclusivity, now using the curriculum and also collaborative research on inclusivity in both STEM climates and STEM processes. That is the actual doing of STEM work, STEM research, engineering research itself. So what I really discovered in putting this slide together was, I think, a truth of a lot of career paths, which is there are threads that connect and threads that split off and sort of go in new places, and your career ends up being a bit of a plaid rather than a linear. But it is fun to look back and see that at the very beginning, I was interested in interdisciplinarity and social justice. I wasn't sure I never would have guessed I would have ended up thinking about STEM predominantly, but where I ended up getting a job also shaped that. So I guess in many ways, my career path has been a perfect example of how interests and choices combined with circumstances to create some really interesting things. And that's why I moved from career path to career adventure, because it's not always under your control, but that's not always a bad thing. You can still make decisions within that. So I'll move to a quick map of this talk. I always find it really helpful if people give me a little sense of what they're going to do. So fairly briefly, I'm going to use this talk to try to offer you a way of thinking about STEM inclusivity and inclusivity in the academy with a schema that breaks down what is usually a very broad or sweeping conversation into some different levels, and tries to imagine that there's ways to organize our thinking about inclusivity in more effective ways. So getting into the more granular idea of what we talk about, I'm going to propose there's 3 levels. There's probably more. There's lots of ways to look at this, but I'm going to offer 3 levels of STEM inclusivity. I'm going to briefly explore the advantages and the limits of each. The disadvantages, I think they're helpful to think about, because ultimately I am not going to argue that one level is better than the other, but that they're all necessary, but they all have strengths and weaknesses. And we're probably going to need to more consciously coordinate these levels, be aware of them, and think about their strengths and weaknesses, orchestrate them relative to our institutions as a way of addressing diversity. So I'm going to argue for more systems thinking and complexity across these 3 levels, which will have strengths and weaknesses. I'm going to rest for a while as the talk moves along on the 3rd level, which is a conceptualization that is a little less familiar than the first 2, which you will be more familiar with. And I'm going to imagine ultimately and ask you to think with me about the idea of integrated diversity, which is looking at these 3 levels or modes of thinking about difference and equity, and to just imagine how they would come together and how they would work together for bigger and stronger effects relatives to thinking about difference in STEM and the academy more generally. Finally, just a reminder, you can put anonymous questions anytime into the anonymous form. So I'm going to start with the most familiar level. We could call it level 1. And it's really the level that we all know. It's probably the level that we start out with thinking about when we think about diversity, the first time we think about it. Even if we are, depending on what groups you belong to, of course, people have different relationships to thinking about diversity. But the one we learn earliest when we think about institutional diversity is different kinds of people in STEM. And this is really the most familiar. So that's the line at the bottom, right? Thinking about the people. So I'm going to posit that there's some qualities to the diversity thinking that are familiar and fairly comfortable and extremely positive. So for example, group-based thinking allows us to imagine that there's not a neutral person that just happens to be an engineer, but that there's all kinds of different people. It forces us to see differences, and it forces us to see power among those differences, and not just among individuals, but systemic, right? So which groups have been classically advantaged, which groups have been classically disadvantaged, right? So when we think about, say, Native American people in STEM, we can think about the systemic disadvantages that Native American communities have gone through, and we attend to paying more attention to making sure that people from those communities have access. So this is something that would be something that sounds really familiar to us. The useful thing about group-based thinking is among all the aspects of diversity and inclusivity, it's one of the few measurable ones. It's actually can be understood as quantitative. So it is, for example, the data that we rely on to help us track diversity is the data that typically comes from group-based measurements. So we can do quantitative data and climate surveys, and that's another kind of diversity and another kind of thinking about difference and information. But the tracking of data, the quantitative tracking of data, is something that is measurable and helps us really attend to difference among us. It is centered on presence and parity. So it is visible, right? So we can ask people, we can track, we can figure out who's in the room, we can attend to that, we can be included ourselves depending on our identities. And we have a typical understanding that parity is important. So for example, if you have 20 people in the room, in the class, on the project, on the team, in the lab, and one of those people or two of those people are women, then you don't have parity, right? Because about 50% of the population is women. So the quantitative measure of the group-based metric helps us think about what we would want. So as you think about this, you can see why this has appealed to institutions for so long, because you have quantifiable groups with some form of measurement that helps us think about how we're doing. On top of that, we typically tend to think that a group-based measurement that we measure for a kind of parity is a positive. And typically in the diversity literature, we're familiar with the discourses and the narratives in which equity and parity is understood to benefit both teams and outcomes. Right? There's an enormous amount of literature that says diverse teams are better teams. Multiple kinds of perspectives help us solve problems better. If you're going to build an X, you'll get a better X, because if you have a mixed group of people in the room, because they'll bring different experiences, and that will improve the outcomes. So the idea of diversity is understood generally in these green dots that I have up here to benefit the people themselves through an inclusion model, but also improve the outcome itself. Right. So we also see it as good for the project, the lab, the institution. Everything gets better when there's diversity. So this tends to sound like a kind of harmonious narrative in which everyone benefits. However, I'm going to also point out, that's the sort of the red bullet points, is that there's a lot of wobble to this really sort of beautiful, clean system that we've set up for thinking about people in STEM. One is that it tends to be based on some groups. So we ask ourselves which groups. We could say, well, it's typically based on race and ethnicity, and it's typically based on the idea of gender, particularly the inclusion of women. So this is sometimes called in the literature the master categories, right? They're understood to be the most important categories in our particular, like in the US at this time. We struggle though, once we start to think about other categories. For example, if you think about the category of disability, with people with disabilities, that is a harder category to think about in this case. People have disabilities. Some people live with disabilities for life, but some people have disabilities temporarily. Some people acquire disabilities. Disability is not a kind of identity category that lends itself easily to the kind of group measurement that something like identifying as a woman would do. So if you get an identity category that has some shift to it, it gets harder to include, which may help explain why we struggle to talk about disability and we include it much less, even though 1 out of 10 people in the US will experience being disabled at some point in their lives, right? So this is a very large group at any given time, and yet it's one that we struggle to bring in under the umbrella of the kinds of metrics and parity that we're used to thinking about diversity. And LGBTQ is another great example. If it's to your detriment to be visible as a member of the community, it's probably less likely that you'll be easy to be counted. So what I'm trying to offer is that, and I'm moving to the limits of demography, there are limits to the group-based methods, even though we like it and we're comfortable with it. And even that can be very challenging in and of itself. But the differences between groups and the different kinds of identities tell us that there's actually a lot of struggle around being truly inclusive, even when we're including groups, because we're actually choosing among groups that are easier to count. I'm not saying easier to include, but easier to count and easier to sort of bring in in terms of demography and in terms of representation. What we start to have with the diversity model is that we start to have that the representation of the problem becomes the solution to the problem. And what I mean by that is we start to say things like, do we have enough X? So my first point is we might not be counting Y and Z. We might just be counting X. That's a problem. But there's also a problem in that even if you have enough, by which I mean parity, you haven't necessarily solved the problem. I'll give you an example. I got an NSF paid grant. It's a research paid grant about 10 years ago, and it was specifically focused on looking at underrepresented women of color, in particular in STEM. The NSF at that time was very clear that talking about Asian and Asian American women should not be part of our project because they were not underrepresented and there were, quote unquote, enough. Now, this puts you in a position which is really interesting because there is no doubt that Asian and Asian American people experience racism, that Asian and Asian American women experience sexism that has to do with sort of racialized sexism. All these things are pushed to the side when you have enough of that kind of person. So you can see the upside and the downside of this model for diversity, and they're very powerful. The other thing is that we understand the numbers game. This institution is doing really well with this number of kind of people. But the question becomes, are those people thriving? Are they doing really well? It's not just who are you counting, which is an issue, but how are they doing? So it's understood to benefit teams and outcomes, and it's understood to be a positive for an institution to be more diverse. But is it really benefiting the people, the diverse people who are being counted and held up as an advantage to the team and the institution? So who really benefits from this kind of diversity? Who is counted? And what does it ultimately mean even to count them in the first place? So what I've tried to do in this slide is offer you all the good things about conventional diversity, all the things our institution, at least I will speak for myself, my institution, especially around STEM diversity, tends to rely on. We're doing really good with women. We're not doing as good as we hope with people of color. That's about the extent of the populations that we talk about. So you can see the benefits, but you can also see the downsides, and also the ultimate question, which I think is ground zero for this, which is who's benefiting from this ultimately? Is it really the people that we are quote unquote including? So I'm not saying there's anything wrong with this approach, but I do want to point out that we tend to rely on it pretty easily. It's got a lot of challenges to it. So this is a second level, and I hope I'm not like cruising along too quickly, but this is because of course I want to have conversation about this. This is the model of inclusive climate. So I'm put at the bottom here, thinking about the cultures in STEM. So what are the different experiences of people in STEM? And we could certainly imagine that this particular model for diversity begins to try to address the questions that are raised by the first model of diversity, who are the people in STEM. So there are a lot of great things about this movement. And I would say in the area of thinking about inclusive STEM, over the last 20 years or so, there has been an almost spectacular surge in the amount of research that is being done. And many of it, very exciting, is interdisciplinary. So it brings in concepts from outside research. So non-STEM research has started to find its way into the conversations, say within inclusivity and engineering, whether it's in the classroom or in the faculty itself, concepts that were unfamiliar maybe 2 decades ago, things like imposter syndrome, concepts like implicit bias, concepts like stereotype threat. These concepts have slowly but surely seeped into, right, the sort of the surface of STEM for folks who are thinking about diversity and inclusivity. And the non-STEM research has started to sort of touch STEM fields. Support structures for student or faculty have slowly been sort of developed. And if you're interested deeply in STEM diversity, this will be familiar to you. All the support structures that many colleges and universities try to put forward to begin to support and address that problem of who is supporting these diverse populations. So an example would be like mentoring programs, for example, right? Not just doing research with someone, but having a mentoring program or mentoring clusters, or thinking about the kinds of things you can do to change persistence. Those kinds of, I would say, adapting these outside of STEM concepts to behaviors within departments or within colleges. Then the idea of assessing policy and procedures, right? So not just looking at how the climate is, but looking at how the structure is, right? So we're looking sort of at the idea of how does tenure work, for example, is a classic. You know, what are the policies around paid leave? How does funding work? What are the priorities within the policies and procedures? That has come under the lens as well. And then, of course, the really big area of helping classrooms in pedagogies, right? What does it mean to teach a gateway course in engineering? What does it mean to teach a weeder course versus something that encourages and supports interest in engineering for undergraduates? Those kinds of conversations start to look at the actual mechanics of STEM itself rather than just the people. However, of course, this also has some weaknesses. One is that over the years, and I've watched this, having done this for a couple of decades, is that it does rely on specialized knowledges. And this is difficult because they are knowledges from sociology, from psychology, from different places. And the question becomes, how do we apply these? And this is where interdisciplinarity, you can see, definitely becomes part of the answer for some of this. But how does this get put into a STEM context? Also, these tend to be ways of tinkering with an institution and not transforming it. So one way to think about the limits of this is the pipeline metaphor. So many of you will be familiar with the pipeline metaphor. This is maybe the most common metaphor. How do we keep students in the pipeline? How do we keep women in the pipeline? How do we keep people of color in the pipeline? And this is very much a pipeline patching kind of approach, right? So here's the question though. What if the pipe is the problem, right? So what if it's not how to keep people from dropping out, but what if the way things are done the institutions themselves? What if the problem is bigger than patching these problems to try to keep people in? So the more radical approach becomes, this isn't really transformative. This is just trying to keep everybody from falling out of the thing itself without looking at the thing itself, which brings me to the third point. It doesn't do a massive rethinking of normative structures. It tries to tinker with normative structures. So of course, it's a tall order to do a massive rethinking, but it's important to remember that climate can be not as transformative as we think. It can be a way of sort of like patching a hole in a leaky pipeline as opposed to a transformative idea, which means that you just you have to keep doing this work. You can never stop because you're not really fixing the problem. You're just patching the problem. And that is something really different than fixing it. So part of the critique of these measures, like let's have a mentoring program, does not answer the larger question, which is, why do we need a mentoring program? What's going on that this person needs this mentoring program? And it's the really deep thing that tends to be overlooked through the climate patching model. There are challenges for STEM classrooms as well. I don't have time for this in my class. I don't have space for this in my class. I don't have expertise for this. And besides, this is not applicable to what I'm doing. If I had a dime for every time someone's told me that, I'd have a lot of dimes because, of course, it is a very reasonable thing to say, I can't teach sociology right now. I'm very, very busy with fluid mechanics, for example. Right. So that mismatch in the classroom is difficult because if the classroom is where the rubber hits the road with climate, it is very difficult to bring in this kind of content unless you are able to do something with co-teaching or something really sweeping, but the average classroom struggles to bring in this kind of content. So you can see how level 2 leans towards and tries to address some of the issues in level 1, for sure. But you can also see how level 2 spins its wheels a little bit because the actual largest system itself is holding some of the problems in place, which is going to bring me to, of course, to level 3. So I'm going to posit beyond diversity and inclusivity, the idea that STEM itself could be different. And this is the more radical idea. So, but not any more or less important than the others. So the approach is going to posit that research and knowledge itself, we can ask the question, what if the assumed separation between engineering, in this case, and issues of inclusivity does not exist? I teach a course called Gender in STEM, and my students typically in Gender in STEM expect me to talk a lot and for us to read a lot about levels 1 and 2. We actually spend most of our time looking at STEM fields and how research is conducted, and they don't expect that. That's always for me a really good indicator that when we think about diversity, we think about the people who are in the room. We think about the climate, what the room is like, but we don't think about what we're doing when we do STEM. So this is an interesting point for me because I am not a STEM professor, right? So I'm not an engineer. So I step back and I see, but I do not do engineering research, right? And that's important, right, as an acknowledgement from my side. So I'm going to posit this. A common way of looking at engineering research and an interest in inclusivity is we struggle to say, how do I do my research, right? How do I look at this? And how am I going to take social issues around inclusivity and how can I make them touch? This model posits that engineering research itself is always linked to the social. It is never not linked to the social, no matter what you are doing. This is a radical thought because we tend to think more, how can I connect it? And this is where the turn in our thinking about diversity and inclusivity and radical changes in STEM for thinking about difference in social justice in STEM. This turn in the road is a sharper one than the first 2 levels, right? We're used to, of course, we want everyone included. We need more of these kinds of people. Of course, we're going to try to have climate conversations, which can be really awkward and difficult, but we understand that we want to have them. So we want to turn even sharper to say, what about the STEM we're actually doing? Move from the question, could we make these connect somehow to, these are always inherently connected, even if it means we are choosing not to talk about certain things or not to include certain aspects in our research, they are always inherently connected. Even if we're not doing it, that's a kind of choice. And this at this level is not so much about the people and not so much about the climate. This is in fact about STEM itself, which is no small thing. So how to make this a little clearer when I say engineering research is always linked to the social. I'm going to try to make it clearer, but if you say inherently connected, what does that mean? I'm going to posit two ways to think about this. The first is the really convenient myth of STEM neutrality. So there's a common belief, and there's a lot of interesting research on this, and I'd love to talk about it. So I don't want to talk too long, but I would love to talk about it. That as you become a person associated with STEM, with science, with engineering, with math, with technology, you become more neutral. You become data reliant, and you do only what the data tells you, and you do experiments that are based on particular kinds of logics, and you are not affected by social issues. So the idea that cultural or social or political concerns can and should be ignored in STEM work, that is actual research. If you do that and you're absolutely neutral and you're absolutely objective, you will arrive at the truth. Right, so there is this belief. Now, there's an interesting study, and I will be happy to share sites if you're interested, that talks about when you're trying to talk about STEM diversity and bias within STEM, bias within any field. As a general rule, scientists and engineers and mathematicians are the most difficult to convince that there is a social aspect to their work, because they are most, to be fair, trained to believe that they are objective. So because objectivity is at the core of doing good research, and reliance on data and only data and facts and only facts is at the core of research, it is very difficult to go back, because that means you're not a good scientist, right? So I'm sort of saying this in very general terms, but I think that should resonate with many people. I mean, typically it does, that idea that somehow no one is objective because we're all influenced by social assumptions. I will say one more thing. It may not be the social assumptions that we as people are making as researchers. It can be the assumptions that are actually shaping the data upon which research relies. So research is cumulative, as we all know, of any kind. And if there have been assumptions or absences in research going forward, then we are relying on that and don't know it. So I want to be very clear that the myth of neutrality is a deep one, and it's not about a personal failure at some level. It's much more about understanding that STEM fields are embedded in the social. So this convenient, because it's pretty convenient to believe you're neutral, is the really awkward work of politicizing STEM. So if you're interested, there's a researcher whose name is Erin Sech, which is spelled C-E-C-H, and she does a lot of work on the idea of repoliticizing STEM work. And the theory here is that the truth that you arrive at objectively is actually a result of all kinds of choices that you have made or that others have made before you. And many of those choices are so normed that we do not see them as choices at all. And that is, in fact, their power. We don't see them as choices at all because it's just how things are done. If you jump back to my first example, we see including certain groups in diversity as what diversity is. We rarely think we're making choices of some groups, but not other groups. So we're choosing through habit, and we're not doing it consciously. So the idea is, of course, not that people are rubbing their hands together and saying, I will ignore X or Y. It's that things are so normed that we're making choices we don't know we're making, which makes it very difficult to correct and critical that we have a raising of consciousness around the social choices that have always been made within this. So it is fair enough to ask at this point, could you give me an example? So that's what I'm going to try to do. I'm going to see if I can do this. Am I sharing my screen right now? Does that look right? Are we seeing a website site?
No, still seeing your presentation.
Okay. Let me see if I can. I'm gonna stop share and reshare. I think that's the, well, let me see if I can. So what I'm sharing right now is the gendered innovations, which is, I'm going to go right to gendered innovations. So this is at Stanford, and it's the brainchild of Londa Schiebinger, who is a marvelous theorist of gender and difference within STEM. And Gendered Innovations is a way of, it's a great website, and it's really useful for me because it's a way of thinking about the third level problems that I'm describing here. So there's two things I wanted to show you, a set of environmental case studies. So what they put together, and it's in different fields, but what they put together is a way of looking at standard research and asking the question, what are we assuming when we do standard research on, say, environmental chemicals, or we do standard research on urban design? What are we leaving out? And what is building on these absences? So when you go to this page, you'll see examples and full case studies of how they look at, in this case, particularly gender, but you can do it in lots of different ways, how they look at and start to ask questions of what always has been assumed around the research, say, in urban planning or the research in housing design. I was struck by this, and I got thinking about actually sharing this with you because I had noticed that you had a speaker a week ago who was, I believe, actually from Stanford, and her name was Sarah Billington. And yes, so she's from this very institution. That's what got me thinking about this as a nice connection. And I was looking at the abstract of that talk, and she shares that buildings of the future should go beyond sort of standard models to infer and support the mental and physical well-being of the occupants. So I loved that the talk right before me did this, because you could see her leaning towards the idea of the social in the larger question of enhanced sustainability in particular kinds of spaces. And what I would say is there's material out there, such as Gendered Innovations, that help you look at a concept like the mental and physical well-being of the occupants and say, for example, what are the systemically disadvantaged groups or the kinds of groups that are ignored for a sort of mythical norm, human who tends to be white, who tends to be male, who tends to be able-bodied. How do we start doing that? Like, what are some ways where we can imagine ourselves as doing science in ways that, rather than just stepping back and not doing this, which is a set of choices based on a mythical norm, how you can sort of imagine a way to be inclusive in the actual, say, design itself or the research itself. So rather than me try to just sort of awkwardly, I'm going to go back to my slides, awkwardly try to tell you about science, what I've really tried to do here is work with their examples. They actually have something that I won't take you to right now called the engineering checklist, which is really quite extensive. If
Are you trying to share your slides right now?
I'm sorry, I am. Have I not?
No, you haven't. Sorry.
Okay, that's okay. No. You know, it changes from thing to thing. Let me share my screen, share my slides. Here we go. How'd I do? Are we back?
All set.
All right, great. Thank you, Rachel. So coming to the end of this third model, they have an engineering checklist, and it's actually amazing to look at. So what I put together, and you know how once you get going on PowerPoint with the shapes, it's just a bad idea. But what I did is, you'll see that diverse populations and climate of inclusivity are familiar, and you'll see that inclusive research design has a sort of a muddier kind of color because I think it flickers in and out of our larger idea about what inclusivity in STEM is. I'm going to posit, though, that these three, the very well established diverse populations, which is serves as both a description of a problem and a metric and a solution, which is not logical, but nonetheless we do it. And then the climate of inclusivity, which it gets harder to measure. And then the question of inclusive research design, which has an even steeper hill to climb. Nonetheless, I'm going to posit that these three things are all necessary and they impact each other. So if you have diverse populations, supporting them through inclusive research design, in the, say, we could imagine doing design that is more conscious of these might help support diverse populations. if that question of how these, how in the climate of inclusivity was shaped, for example, how these things happen, would that be helped by having more diverse populations who are more interested in inclusive research design? So in other words, one might help the other all the way around all the time. One thing that is not present, despite my interest in finding shapes on PowerPoint, is not present, and you might notice it right away, is who is the actor that makes this happen? And in many ways, that is the sort of the magic lever to this. If this is an acceptable model, if it gives names to levels of diversities in useful ways, if it looks at pros and cons, if it does all those things and it posits that they interact, the question becomes for any institution, any department, any place, any company, how will we make these things work together? And that becomes a long list of what will the incentives be? Who will be rewarded for doing inclusive research design? How will we make sure that our population knows that's what we do here? And finally, I'm going to wrap up pretty soon because I want there to be time. I will just say that graduate students are a great way to look at this. I got thinking about this because of Rachel, of course, but what are you doing to get diverse populations of students into, say, any graduate school? Who are you looking for? What groups are you forgetting? And how are you prioritizing that? And how are you being exclusive by never naming those groups when you talk about diversity? What is your climate like? What is the climate like for graduate students? What kind of research is being prioritized? Is that research connected to the kinds of diverse populations that you're interested in? Is the climate sort of supporting them as they do that research? It's really useful to look at slightly smaller scale populations within any place. It can help you think about who is in the room, what temperature is in the room, and how the work is happening and what work is happening in that particular room. So I just blew through a solid 40 minutes of a lot of material. And I want to say thank you for listening to me at this just dreadful time of year to try to listen to a talk and express my appreciation again. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Professor Armstrong, for that amazing talk. I'm really hopeful that we're going to be able to apply some of the principles that you discussed here, in our department and in our research, and continue this conversation going forward. So I think before I get to the anonymously submitted questions, perhaps I'll open it up to anyone who'd like to ask aloud. I don't see any hands coming in yet, so I will go ahead and get started with some of these anonymous submissions. First up, could you speak more to the myth of neutrality in STEM and how it develops over the course of an engineer or scientist education?
The question, it's a great one. So I'm going to recommend a reading that is really fantastic. It's old and it's really good. It's by Evelyn Fox Keller. She wrote a book in the 80s called Gender and Science. The introduction to that book talks about objectivity and neutrality in STEM. It's highly readable. It's very, very clear. So first off, if that's an interest, that's what I'm going to recommend. Super easy reading, 10 pages, does a lot of work. The myth of neutrality in STEM is really interesting. There's a lot of great work on there. People have been talking about it for a long time. One of the reasons why I recommend that reading, and I'm going to sort of speak from her perspective because I'm a big fan and she does a great job, is she talks about how objectivity is not possible, but it's preferable. It's just that no one can be. And so the way to get objectivity at its very highest in STEM is to realize and admit that things are always affecting you and to pay attention to that. That's, for example, science or engineering kind of has a gender, for example, it has a race. It is carrying all kinds of cultural messages. Rather than pretending that that is not true, thinking about what impact it has. If you let go of objectivity, like I will close my eyes, I will be colorblind, I will see nothing, it won't make you more objective. It'll make you more narrow. It'll limit what you do. But if you can say, I know I'm not objective, the win is you become more objective as you do that. So if you're able to acknowledge the things that affect then you actually get closer to the unattainable goal, but you'd rather be closer to it than far away. So that's what a lot of the work on that myth talks about. No one is objective. I'm not objective either. I'm influenced by my identity, my background, things around me, my institution, all of that. So is everyone. The question is how much you want to be aware of that and how much you want to take into account and push back against it. I hope that answers it.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. So I will do my best to sort of summarize this question for you. So it often feels like we have to commodify diverse people when we're speaking to people in power in order to kind of get the support for our DEI endeavors that we need to make progress. So like, for example, the NSF wants to improve participation of underrepresented groups in science as a matter of national security because of how our country's demographics are changing. And universities tout diversity metrics as a recruitment strategy. So how can we move this conversation toward a strategy that centers on humanity by supporting diverse people in STEM because they deserve to be here and not because their being here is good for us?
What a great question. It was long, but it was beautiful. It was sophisticated. It got at a really important question. The feeling that people have, often people who understand themselves as part of underrepresented groups, but anyone can sort of feel this, is that diversity is starting to be sort of mechanized, right, and monetized. Is like we will get better products with diversity. So let's get those people in here. One of the downsides of our reliance on quantitative numbers, and this is a double-edged sword. We want more diverse populations because people should have access, right? And they should be encouraged to be in STEM. And everybody I know in STEM believes that. It's not just for better products. It's because they want everybody to have access to being engaged in this field. The problem is we've gone so far in our metrics for populations is that it's hard for us now. It's almost, you could say it's almost off-putting to diverse people to be like, come on in and we'll make a better product. If you look at the NSF's sort of its driving rationale, the federal government gives them money because they promise a more diverse population in STEM and they STEM inclusive, and they promise better outcomes. It is not about the thriving and the humanity of the people. And if you read that, you will see that that is true. What I'm saying is accurate. It's because it is good for the US economy. That is why we support inclusivity with federal tax dollars. That's quite a message when you think about it, because it's the opposite of supporting the humanity of people. And once you get in there, the feeling is like, well, you're here to support the US economy, to which the, be like, oh, great, right? So what about my thriving? So I think this window, I don't have the answer, but I do think this window of conversation of like, why do we want you? Why do you want me? What am I good for? Like, am I being used, or what's the issue here, is one we never have and we need to. It's very important. I wish I had the answer. Boy, do I wish I had the answer, but it's a very important conversation. We have it very rarely.
Right, thank you. Okay. I think we have time for, okay. We have a question from Phoebe in the chat. And Phoebe says, for abstract things like department culture, it can often be difficult to communicate and quantify the factors that are insidiously excluding people. How would you recommend people go about communicating these things? How do you recommend the people in power receive these communications to facilitate change that actually improves experiences of larger groups of students?
Well, great. Thanks, Phoebe. That's a great comment. It's a great question. So I'm going to, I like it especially because it's asking, how do you improve a climate on the ground, like with the people involved? First of all, the acknowledgement that power is in the room, that this is a slope, right? So often people at the top of the slope think they can say, we're just going to have a conversation and there's no slope. I'm here to tell you, you cannot wish that slope away, right? So rule number one for me is always, you can't say, don't worry, I know I have power over you, but it doesn't matter. sorry, you don't get to like, that doesn't work like that. You don't get to be like, my power doesn't matter. That is not how power works. It's like when people in power say, let me be vulnerable. Well, if it's your choice to be vulnerable, you're not really that vulnerable, right? So I think the main thing is to realize is for people in power, right? So faculties and people who make decisions, actually the lift is theirs. So my answer about climate is always this: we often rely, Lafayette College does this, we rely on students to make the difference. Actually, the people in power should be taking the lead. If that is working with, say, students or graduate students to find out, do a climate survey. There are so many good climate surveys out there, but just don't do one and be like, oh, look, have a climate survey. And it doesn't mean there's an emergency. If you do a climate survey, do a climate survey, find out what you find out, but already know that you're going to do a working group, right? Where you're going to have faculty and grad students and students. You're going to, you know, there's so many models out there where the just don't do a climate survey and they go, wow, that was bad. Now I'm really embarrassed. Now we're really not going to talk about it. That is bad. Do not do a climate survey and do that. Have a plan, have an arc. And there's so many ways you can do that. If you look at advanced institutions, the advanced institutions for 20 years have put out climate surveys. You can do that. And it takes the sting out of it because nothing's as beautiful as data, right? Because like, that's what we love. So I would suggest a plan, a diversity committee, not to solve the problems, but to find a plan for getting data for understanding the problems and then think about addressing them. And don't do it in a bubble. There are so many places doing this. It's crazy. There's
Right.
so much out. Don't reinvent the wheel.
Thank you so much, Professor Armstrong. We are out of time, although we do have a couple remaining questions. I'm sorry we haven't gotten to them, but we really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us. I'm really excited about how we kind of use our new understanding of inclusivity in STEM going forward.
Thank you for having me today. And I'm sorry if that was like a drink from a fire hose.
It was amazing.
I know it's a lot, but thank you so much for having me. And I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to talk more because I really, really, really love to have these conversations. But thank you. And thank you, Rachel. It was a lot of fun putting this together.